What is the best rendering engine for architects? Well, it's not that straightforward of an answer to be honest, but that's what this video is all about. This is the Ultimate Render Engine Comparison, a full guide to help you discover what's the best tool for your current workflow. But before a winner is chosen, I need to present you some data. I'm gonna be as impartial as I can on this comparison and try not to give my opinion as much as possible. And I have even asked the community to help me out with this. So we do this as a collaborative process. We have got images from the same scene, interior and exterior, from all different engines done by architects and artists all around the world. I've also passed around a survey to give us some more info. Okay, so let's begin setting the stage for this discussion. Here are the main render engines I considered for this comparison: V-Ray, Lumion, Twinmotion, Enscape, D5, Unreal Engine, Corona with 3ds Max, and Cycles with Blender. These are the ones I know are most used by all of you, and here we're talking more specifically about architects and architecture students who do visualization as part of their day-to-day tasks. But it's not necessarily their main focus. I know there are a lot more software, but for the sake of maximizing this comparison, these are the most used in the architecture industry. Feel free to add the one you use down below in the comments to help more people know about it. Now let's lay some important data so we can start seeing the biggest differences between the engines. And later in this video I'll show you the exterior and interior image comparison. Now, based on the survey I have put up, these are the results on the render engine popularity, which is not a surprise to me, to be honest. We've got Twinmotion with a slight edge here, but not following too far behind is Lumion, Enscape, V-Ray, and then with D5 included, those are what most fit into a typical architectural workflow where you need to design and visualize at the same time. More advanced engines like Corona, Unreal Engine, and Cycles are more powerful with complex tools and allow a ton of procedural stuff. I would personally separate them into different categories with very distinctive user bases. And remember, here I'm trying to take into account the whole world and its diverse architectural practices. Okay, so don't come say in the comments that Rhino, Revit, and this X render engine is the professional standard and using any other software is just dumb, because Europe and North America aren't the whole world, okay? You see, when it comes to pure architectural visualization, no design workflow involved, we know that 3ds Max with Corona dominates the market across the globe. However, the learning curve is much steeper than a typical architecture engine, not to mention the complex UI and technical viewing are not really ideal for the back and forth design iteration that is much needed when designing a building. In that sense, I would group the engines this way. Lumion, Enscape, D5, and Twinmotion are easy to learn and easy to master, and you can get fairly decent results in no time. V-Ray is slightly to the side here with a slightly steeper learning curve and more complex UI, but then also allows you more flexibility and complex results. And then you may go to Unreal Engine, Corona with 3ds Max, and Cycles on Blender. They are much more advanced software that can get incredible results with a ton of realism, but again, it demands much more skills and often a lot more time invested to extract the best results. And I want to emphasize that it's clear that a pure architecture visualization program is usually not ideal for the typical architectural workflow with iterations, plan creation, and so on. Now, some would say that pricing is what really matters when deciding what render engine is the best fit for your practice. I don't know if that's true when the difference is so little when we're talking about professional level software, definitely for students and recent grads, so we gotta compare pricing plans. First up, we have free options. Blender with Cycles is completely free to use. It has a GPL, a general public license. That is one of the main reasons it has gained a ton of traction over these past few years. Unreal Engine is essentially free to use as well. It has a paid annual plan, but for architectural purposes, it doesn't really matter. Then we have D5 with only $38 a month, Corona for around $54. Then Twinmotion has a different pricing structure. You buy a perpetual license for $749, and then you only pay after a year annually to get the upgrade for $199. Then V-Ray for SketchUp for around $79 a month. Next up, Enscape for around $85 a month. And finally, the most expensive of them all is Lumion. And here I'm not even considering the standard plan because it has a ton of limitation that in my point of view don't really justify going for it. The Pro version is a whopping 14.99 euros annually. I know they say 124 euros per month, but in reality, if you're solo or a small team, you're realistically looking at the big number here. Larger offices can take that investment annually and won't even bother. So then it might be fair to compare them in an annual method of payment. right? And this is how it goes. Some go down drastically, giving you more discount for this full payment upfront, which is always important to consider. Oh, and worth mentioning, but I think Twinmotion has some sort of purchasing power parity. It sometimes shows me the price with local currency, which is lower than the standard rate, so that's nice to see. Talking about pricing is not that simple. We shouldn't look at just the render engine pricing, as you often need a 3D modeler software, or it will be the BIM software you already use and pay for. But this certainly lays a good foundation for the specific comparison that we're doing. Now, if we take a look at this chart here, based on the survey, this is how each engine user feels about price fairness. Quite interesting to see, right? This directly relates to the pricing structure that we just saw of each engine. Now, if you're a student and are using the engine for academic projects, you shouldn't really pay, right? Well, from the paid engines, only Twinmotion and D5 have a real free version that is easy to get hands on. Lumion does have a full education free version, but it's a bit more difficult to get, and apparently you need to go through a local reseller. Now, Enscape, V-Ray, and Corona, which are all owned by the same group, Chaos, require students to pay. And if that wasn't bad enough, its only payment option is annually. As I said, I'm not trying to be biased here, just give you plain data for a fair comparison. But honestly, I feel that this is such a mistake. You see, the whole idea of an engine being massively adopted by the industry, regions, or market can be hugely impacted by students learning it and then knowing they can achieve consistent results with the tool later in their careers. If there are amazing engines like D5 and Twinmotion that are completely free to use for students without limitations and easy to get your hands on, this just makes others seem not worth it. I know it's not like that, but let me know what you think in the comments below. And I would think that it's not like they are making a huge profit by charging $149 a year from students, but it is a ton of money to pay as a student, especially from developing countries. Data and technical info are important, and we have a lot more to explore in this video, but it only shows part of this comparison. We'll go back to the data in just a second, but I want to show you the images created with each of these engines. I know the ideal scenario would be for me to have the skills to achieve the best result with each of these engines to show you, and then you get to decide which one looks better, but that's obviously not the case. So to not add my influence over the engines I'm proficient at, I asked over Instagram for the community to join in. We have some incredible submissions. I gave all of the participants the same briefing for an interior and exterior scene. I'll show you the images without commenting specifically on them. So without bias, you analyze the images by looking at reflections, textures, lighting, vegetation, and all of that good stuff that you know is essential when creating a rendering. So in no particular order, let's start with Lumion. Maik with a 2023 Lumion version, and he explored both with and without ray tracing. D5, Beltran did two different options, and Ibsa used D5 with the free community version. Enscape, Byron, and Tristan. Twinmotion with Ewing's work. V-Ray from my good friend Tony from TN3D Studio, which by the way has some fantastic tutorials. Then Unreal Engine with Kalik, and Corona 3ds Max from Mustafa Submission. And lastly, Cycles Blender with Leon. I honestly loved seeing these results. It adds an extra layer to this whole comparison, but please keep in mind that despite each artist following the brief I gave, their skill levels can vary, and different intentions with the image atmosphere can also impact the result. And I know how important post-production is in image creation, however I asked them not to do any post-production so that we could look at the engine's raw results. Okay, now back to data and specs. Let's take a look at the features. There are a ton of things we could cover here to compare them all: effects, material settings, asset library, post-production capabilities, and so on. Overall, the survey shows that users are mostly satisfied with their current render engine of choice, averaging at around 8 out of 10. We all know that there's no perfect engine that has every feature to everyone, but this just confirms that. Now, I feel that a good library of assets is one of the features that can not only save you a massive amount of time when visualizing a project, but also help you achieve high quality results. Often paid models such as vegetation can get pricey and not always easy to implement into every workflow. So those engines that are providing an extensive library of resources certainly have an edge on this comparison. V-Ray and Corona can use Chaos Cosmos, which is a completely ready-to-use library with both materials and objects. Enscape has its own asset library as well, but being in the Chaos group and having integration with V-Ray can also take advantage of this, thus expanding the options even more. Lumion is widely known for its complete library with even options for animated assets and fine detail. Twinmotion has got its own extensive library plus access to Quixel Mega Scans, which some would say is what makes Twinmotion ahead of the competition. D5 has a huge library as well, also with detailed objects and animated assets, and that's pretty much it. We can then group the engines into built-in library and no library. You can get access to free libraries of assets with Unreal Engine and Cycles with Blender, but then for this specific case, with vetted and reliable resources, they go into the second category. Now, still on the topic of features, compatibility is a big factor to be considered. It's no use to have an outstanding engine that is not compatible with your design workflow, that being BIM, CAD, or something else. Some of the engines are plugins that overlay onto the 3D software, and others are standalone type of programs. Here's how they're classified. Plugins that work with major BIM, Revit, ArchiCAD, or others, or 3D software like SketchUp, Rhino, and so on. Then standalone applications with some sort of live connection between the engine and the 3D software, the modeler or BIM, or independent, as I'm calling it. That is the 3D software that has the engine that only works between the two. Each one of these groups comes with pros and cons, and it will be a better fit depending on your workflow. Now, other features we could compare, maybe the most important may be PBArch workflow, the ability to create realistic and complex materials. All of them have this taken care of. I know this is bare minimum, but some allow you much more control and extra settings, such as adding layers of smudges, adjustments, noise maps, procedural stuff, and more. For me, a deal breaker is render elements, like render channels. All of them have this option, again, some with even more control, but it's hard to believe that Twinmotion does not allow you to export channels. If you're serious about ArchViz, this can be hard to overcome. I wouldn't say it takes Twinmotion out of the race entirely, because Twinmotion does have a good engine with Path Tracer, and just as I'm recording this video, apparently Lumen from Unreal Engine has been implemented into Twinmotion, which is to show that it has a ton of potential, but it's something vital to be considered in this comparison for sure. On the same note of post-production capabilities, all of them have some sort of built-in tools that allow you to tweak a bit of exposure, color correction, bloom, warmth, and so on. Some engines with more and some less. Personally, I never relied on these to correct anything on the render, as Photoshop is much more powerful to work with it, but it can be interesting to tweak some things on the render engine before it bakes in all of the effects. A much less important item for most people, but that often gets me, and now I'm thinking more specifically about students overall, is the ability to work with parallel projections or create diagrams in some ways. V-Ray, especially with SketchUp, is super strong when talking about that. It gives you a ton of flexibility to export isometrics both in line files to then work in Adobe Illustrator, but then also to create clay renders to spice it up even more, or even then explore a full physical model solution. All of these engines have a parallel projection option, which is often also called as orthographic view, apart from D5. Recently, I wanted to do a diagram for a competition I joined and couldn't use D5 for this. I did the renderings with it, but not the diagram. Now, all of them can, in a way, do clay renders or simulate physical models, which then I'll give a slight edge to Cycles with Blender and then Corona 3ds Max for having a powerful 3D modeler associated with it. There are many other aspects that we could add to this comparison, things that could be a decision-making factor to you, but that I might not have covered in this video. This comparison could honestly be a full hour. We could look at operating systems they run. Mac users usually have fewer options to choose from, or what's the rendering type, like real-time, GPU, CPU, ray tracing or not. System requirements is also a thing we could look, and many other things. I tried to include what I thought to be the most important for you to take into account, and all of this to then say that the best render engine actually depends. We looked at so many variables here, and it's not reasonable to say that one is better than the other 7 here, because it needs to fit your needs. Let me give you some examples of what I consider to be the best engine for each scenario. Now, if you don't care too much about visualization and just want to get good results with very little work, go for Twinmotion, D5, Lumen, or Enscape. But then if you're on a budget at the moment, D5 might be the best solution out of the 4. If you're a student and need more creative flexibility to create different styles of renderings or diagrams, and also don't have a powerful machine, V-Ray can be a great alternative. It has always been my favorite when I was in architecture school. Now, if you only think about architecture visualization and isn't really designing or iterating, you may want to look at Corona, Unreal Engine, or Cycles. Out of these three, if you want to work for an ArcViz studio, 3ds Max with Corona might be the safest bet. But if you want to explore new technology and look at what might be the next step of ArcViz, Unreal and Blender is the way to go. Now, if you don't want to get out of a BIM software to visualize, then an engine that works directly with ArchiCAD or Revit is the answer. You see where this is going? Personally, I believe that if you learn how architecture visualization works at its core, it doesn't really matter what tool you're using. You can easily migrate to another engine if, say, it has a better pricing, a better compatibility, or extra tools you need, and so on. That's why often an annual plan is tough to commit to. I actually want to hear from you now. Which rendering engine do you think is the best one at the moment? Let me know in the comments below and we can continue this conversation there.